Often, we'll notice that the same type of experiences keep occurring in our lives in a cyclical pattern, which can cause us extra frustration as we scream out, "Why is this happening again?" But what if these are just tests from the universe giving us another opportunity to choose a different way to respond instead of reaching out of the frustration that may be present, changing the energy, and setting a new cycle, aligning us closer to a state of wellness? Over the past week, I had not one of these patterns revisit, but two intertwining, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to share my experience and journey through these with you, providing Alexander more and different domestic experiences to break down that many of us can relate to, helping to change perspectives and get you closer on your individual journey toward energetic wellness.
Thank you, beautiful people. Alexander here. I just wanted to give a shout out to all you that are supporting us, and for the newcomers that feel drawn to give in some way, sharing the podcast or word of mouth goes a long way. Anyone that feels drawn to help us out monetarily, it helps us to continue providing this information for people that can't afford private sessions or are struggling in their own private lives. The link for that donation is wise-wise.com/support. Even rating and leaving reviews on iTunes or commenting on YouTube really helps us out. Liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube and Spotify channels so you know when our newest releases are released. So deep soul, thank you to everyone out there. We're sending you love. So let's continue to grow together and learn to make love with the friction in life.
And now, all of you pattern makers and breakers, let's journey.
Wise.
With Aaron and Alexander.
Uncovering our authentic self
Through self-awareness, conscious communication, and emotional responsibility. Just like we did with the My Personal Journey episodes where we hosted people, listeners out there who have utilized the Just philosophy to change their lives and then pause and reflect on the changes that they have made through listening to the podcast and maybe even having sessions from you, Alexander. I recently, in the last few days, have had some reflection in how I've handled situations that have kind of been a pattern over the last few years that have come into my life and, caused a shakeup. Even in, like, we may have mentioned these in past episodes, but they caused me to have major energetic reactions, emotional reactions in certain instances. And so when very similar situations came around in this last week, it was interesting to see and reflect back on how I've handled these. And even on it may not have been like a conscious level initially.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's even interesting to look into how I handle them subconsciously and then also looking at the level of energy that I was at when these things came into play.
Right.
So I'll just briefly go into what happened. I was traveling over the past weekend, and when I came home, I noticed my heat was out, and, it could have been days that it was out. I was gone for 3 or 4 days, and it was pretty cold, getting into like the 30s, 20s at night. So there was some alarm, but I do have a wood stove and gas logs. So it's, I have an area of the house that I can keep warm. So when I saw it, I was just like, okay, this is just something I have to deal with. There was no, reaction in my chest or anything, which was really good to see because this has happened about a year ago, within, give or take a month or two. The same thing was happening where I was getting, my breaker was jumping off the panel for whatever reason, and my heat was going out. And I remember being frustrated, emotionally around that for days.
Right.
And so it was late, so I just went to bed and thought that I would call. I have a friend who is an electrician, and I would call him in the morning and see if I could get a hold of him. If I couldn't, then I would try to find an electrician.
Right.
So the next day, I get up and I walk downstairs, and it's pretty chilly, but I just happened to glance out on the porch, and there was a dog laying on my porch. And in the past, I've had animals that just come up on my porch. A couple of years ago, there was another dog who I found on my patio furniture just laying there. And that was an experience that I had where that brought a lot of emotions into me, and I invested a lot of energy around that situation. And we'll go into more of that later.
Right. And so here as well, there's two patterns happening simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly.
With the dog on the porch and the heat going out. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah. And so after I saw the dog, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I may have even laughed, but I walked and I just started my morning. I think I took a hot shower so I could warm up. I did eventually call my neighbor, and I couldn't get a hold of him, so I tried. And eventually the word got out, and around late afternoon, he just stopped by, and he came down, looked at the situation, and said that I was going to be without heat until Wednesday morning. So this was Monday that he came by. That was a slightly alarming because I'm like, well, it's Wednesday, but there is an adjustment that I also have to make because up north, everybody expects everything to be done right away. And so all the contractors do everything right away. Down here, especially when you're dealing with like a friend or a neighbor or somebody it's more lax. So I'm still like making an adjustment around that because I've been trained that you're not going to do this right away, Right. So he was just like, hey, you're going to be without heat. And he's very like casual about it. So I was kind of like, okay. It just took me a second to understand the situation and accept it. And I, went through my head and I was like, okay, am I going to be okay? He's saying I'm going to be okay, but am I really going to be okay? And he was like, oh, you have heat, you have ways of heating. And I was like, yeah, I do. I'll be okay. So in that moment, I had to kind of take a second to myself and get to a point of acceptance that what he was saying, it did resonate and I was okay with it. And, sometimes I do that and I say I'm okay to that person, but after I'll have an emotional reaction.
Right. That's key.
Yeah. And I may like even call up somebody, be like, oh, this happened. I'm upset about it. But I did have a moment of true acceptance in that moment. I have this person who I've trusted, who has worked on my house before, who I trust as an individual, stand-up person. I know his value system and I know his intentions. The other side could be, okay, well, he's saying Wednesday, so I could just call somebody else.
Sure.
And I don't know them. I don't know where they'll be coming from. I don't know how much they'll charge me. And I don't know their intentions. And I'm a very private person. I don't like too many people just coming into my house. So I was able to accept that and make that, accept the cost of that. That it was going to be an extra day, probably.
Yeah.
So I dealt with it. I went out and got wood for the wood stove because I wasn't prepared. I kept putting that off.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that I would pay somebody for wood this season, but I did go off and get some. And so I did have to make there was a physical cost to this decision, which I do enjoy. I do enjoy the physical labor and just like being in that mindset of, because it's almost like a meditation chopping wood for me. Right. So it was kind of good that went hand in hand with this process. Well, anyway, getting back to the dog, I just figured that the dog was just here. He ran away and that I was just going to, put it on the Lost Pets Facebook group, and the owner would eventually come. There was a moment where the FedEx guy came and the dog started barking, and that triggered a memory for me because I remember hearing this noise because it was a certain type of bark where it almost sounded like a donkey or a cow. I'm not sure. There's this noise that I hear sometimes in the distance, and it sounded like that. And then I had this kind of flashback to the night before where I heard this constant noise, and I thought the matrix had been compromised because this noise kept going at a certain rate. Where a dog like will take time in between its barks. different time periods where it will stop barking and then bark again if there's, something that it wants to bark at. But this one just kept going at a certain like rate. So it was weird. I was like, what is that noise? And then I saw people in the field diagonal from me in their car, and I was wondering why they're out there. And this new noise was coming from that distance. And I didn't put two and two together until just then when I heard his bark that this was a lost dog. They were looking for him. They didn't find him. Eventually he made his way onto my porch.
Right.
And so the right thing to do would be to put that out on Facebook. And eventually, I knew that he would be found by them. And I did see a white truck go by very slowly and kind of stop in front of me, but the dog he was on the other side of the house then, so they couldn't see him. And I tried to go out there and run after them, but they were gone. So I did have faith that eventually, if he came back on my porch, if I just left him there, didn't interact, he knew that there was no like energetic acceptance of him being there, so that he knew that there was that boundary.
Right. Yeah, or resistance created.
Yeah.
It was really
just
like
like
neutrality.
Yeah, you're welcome to be here, and by being here, you're in the line of sight that your owner will see you.
And so quickly, just summarize very briefly the difference between both the last time the heat thing and this time the heat thing, and your different responses. And same with the dog.
Yeah, I know it is a lot because there's two interwoven stories. But with the dog, the last time it caught me off guard when I came downstairs in the morning and saw a dog there, and I felt this need to take care of it, but I was also had this resent built, like, I have to take care of another dog.
Right.
And like that, those are two totally different reactions. And then the last time, because I felt like I had to take care of it, I did go out there, I did feed it, and I did put a ton of energy into finding the owner. And when the owner could not be found, I had that dog on my porch for 3 days, I think it was, before the animal control came, and we have a non-kill shelter, so I just want to put that out there. I would not send a dog to a kill shelter. They take in animals and they get them checked out, and then they put them up for adoption on Facebook, and they have a great track record. So I trusted that process, but the dog did hang around there for 3 days because I felt like I had to take care of him, and I fed him, and I made him feel like maybe there was another home there or something like that.
Well, and this is where I want to bring in the concept of how everything on this planet and experience needs friction to grow. And by grow, sometimes that just means linger. And you were very open with how the resistance that you were carrying last year with that and how it lingered for like 3 days. And then you were sharing with me right before we started the podcast how it wasn't necessarily automatic, but you noticed that your pattern of response was actually responding this time rather than reacting, which is the emotions. So it's a beautiful example of not feeding something friction, not creating resistance to it, but what we talk about over and over of how acceptance is the very first key to lasting change. And acceptance, again, does not mean condoning or approving of. Like, you didn't condone or approve of that dog being on your porch, but you just accepted that it was there and that the energy would move through. And I think that's a very key point to bring out, both with the dog and with the heater.
Yeah, and with the dog, I took a moment and accepted that the dog was on my porch, and that, what could I do without investing a lot of energy into this situation. And I knew that the answer was, post on Facebook just to get it out there that there was this dog out there, because I had a goat on my property. I don't know if I shared this on the podcast. I was trying to corral him into my property. So again,
trying to help.
Yeah, because I posted it on Facebook again just to see if the owners were around, and I went up to approach him, and he got scared, and he got his head stuck in my fence. And then so I had to spend time. Well, I actually went to all my neighbors to see if somebody could help me out, because I don't have any experience with goats, with horns, and so. But I did suck it up, and I did pull my energy in and to calm the goat, and I was able to cut my fence to get him out there. So it's funny that these patterns keep happening with animals, and
Yes, and the other thing that I want to bring in really quick here is touching on these 5 levels and understanding how something as simple as a dog being on your porch that you don't particularly want there, the cascade of how that can affect all the 5 levels in a reaction. Because, see, normally it starts with the mental, and the resistance is created, and then that activates the emotions, which drains the energetic field, which then if something physical has to be done with the situation, you don't have the strength to do it, so it tires you out more. And the possible beginning of all of this that I'm trying to get people to really focus on right now is the spiritual aspect, and that we can be guilty of thinking that the mental aspect is that first step of how we think about it. But our perception, from my view, is very connected to that spiritual level. Because if you trust, once again, that everything's in divine order, if you have faith, then see, we don't have to go through these negative emotions. We don't have to go through those reactions. And that's what stops that cascading of going through and depleting all the different levels of that field, and why acceptance at that very beginning is so important, because it doesn't create that activation to ripple through all the other fields and start the deterioration of them. So it's amazing how, and I think this is just a great example that you've brought up of how different your experience was. And I think you even mentioned to me that you don't know that even that step of acceptance was necessarily conscious, but it was maybe showing proof of the work that you've been doing. And I think that was a great thing to point out, because we're habitual creatures, and anything we practice over a long period of time will become the new norm, so to say. And so this is a great time to take these subjects and bring it into everyone's world, wherever you are right now, because really not much is going the way that anyone wants it. And pay attention to how much you resist it, how long it may be lasting, and to really take a look at this perception of acceptance. And I think you're doing a great job of explaining 2 different experiences. And that was probably, would you say, the key point was that level of acceptance?
Yeah, and like you said, when I look back on it, I can't say that I was like 100% conscious in both initially. Right. And I do feel it was more subconscious. The effort has been made on my subconscious development, because that allowed the moment of time before I could be conscious to come in and step in and be like, okay, this does require me to be conscious, and let's figure out the best way consciously to go about this after the initial level of acceptance.
Right. And I think that it's important to see, this is why it's important to practice every day on the little things. The little things give you preparation for a so-called big thing, which, being out of heat could have been a big deal, because that could have happened during a snowstorm or something like that. So once again, to find a way to be grateful for whatever you're going through, because it can always be worse. And that is a tool that many, many people forget. And so whatever struggles you're going through, truly take the time. I think it's worth sometimes to be grateful for our own friction and struggles. And that can help put them into a different perception or perspective.
Exactly. And that helps with the whole acceptance but not condoning of the entire situation.
Right. And that's challenging for a lot of people, since I've been sharing this work, that they see that acceptance as negative, and that you're just being too passive, and you don't really some people have even tried to suggest that you're not making a stand. And really, in my perception, you can only truly make a stand once you accept the situation that you're in. That does not mean that I agree with it. It just merely means I accept for what is actually in front of me, and now my next movement is to adjust this that I've just accepted. And so many times people will try to fix or change things without accepting it, and that's normally why it doesn't stick and why the pattern isn't able to be broken.
Yeah, because if you can't accept it, then it's almost like you're denying reality. Because and you can tell me if this is how you also or see it as well. Like with the dog being there, my accepting of it is that, okay, this is actually happening. There's actually a dog here. Like, period. Like,
Right.
that is the acceptance.
That's the acceptance.
If I was resisting, I'd be like, no, I can't believe there's a dog here again, that type of thing, right?
Right, yes. And it is many times, anytime you use the word again, that shows that pattern. That you haven't accepted it in the past, and now you're not accepting it again in this situation. And so that's a very subtle but huge detail in people progressing in their individual work and changing patterns and breaking family lineage and things like that. And we're in the holiday season, and we're all going to get plenty of practice, or most people will, through their family, and we're going to talk about a little bit about that in another episode as well.
So, eventually I'll just sum up the dog thing. So eventually the owner did come by, and he did see the dog on the front porch, and he called to him, and he came running and took him away. So,
Right.
So that was a happy ending. That all worked out.
And was that the same day?
Yes, same
Yes,
day. Yep.
Yeah. So once again, just recognizing the different time lengths through resistance, 3 days, and then through acceptance, less than a day.
And I was in a state of knowing that was going to happen. Whether that was a belief, I'm not sure. I just knew what I had to do in my role for this to work out.
Yes, and that's the key of acceptance. See, acceptance puts us in direct alignment with the divine or what the universe is trying to support. If you're not accepting the situation, you're not in alignment, so you're not going to see it clearly. So, yes, many people will say that they have had a premonition, or they just really felt strongly it was going to work out, and that's easy for me to believe because you're in the matrix at that point. And so that when you're in alignment with what is happening, you can see what is coming, so to say. And this is where I think that people get mixed up with their view of manifestation, and when really you're just being given a view because you're in alignment with the frequencies and how everything's being supported to move forward.
And in my past pattern, the way I reacted, I probably could have even invested way more energy than I had to get, and I got a different result because I wasn't accepting the situation for what it was.
Right, and make an attempt to fix it or help it. And here we bring in one of my favorite sayings of good intentions are the death of a wise one, that action isn't always best. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And sometimes that pause, that acceptance, like you said, when you worked with that goat that got stuck, that you calmed your energy first, and that helped to calm the goat's energy. And see, when we're frustrated or we don't want to be dealing with something, and parents, listen to this, that when you get frustrated with your kids, you give that energy to them. And they're probably, anything they're doing is going to aggravate you. And so if you have a problem child or a problem situation with the child, especially being in lockdown right now, and the child's going through frustration, check with the other people in your home, including yourself, and see if maybe the child is just mirroring and picking up the energy of what's going on around. And many parents will try to force the child into a situation while they're dealing with their own frustration. So it can be very tricky out there with this subtle energy.
And one more thing about the dog and my past situation, I did post on social media on my personal Facebook page about the dog. And I didn't do that this time because I brought so much attention to it
Yes,
from
I
people
remember
that know me.
Yes.
And they know that, they know that in the past I've taken in a lot of animals. And so they were like, oh, it chose you, you should keep it. And then that just brought even more resistance because I was in a state where I was still battling with the universe and trying to draw a boundary, trying to be clear and exemplify what I wanted to do, but I wasn't there yet. And I was still struggling with telling the universe, no, I can't take animals on anymore in this, in my life at that time period. So that brought a lot more friction and made the whole situation even more frustrating.
Yes, and for those of you out there that, might have similar patterns or connections to animals or outreach programs or anything like that, pay attention to if you've been involved with a program or taking in animals or something for 7 years. See, some people do this type of thing for their whole lives, and you'll never run out of animals that need shelter. But what I'd like people to start to realize is that we can take turns and we can play different roles. And because would you say that you took in animals for less than 7 years or 7 years or more than 7 years? How would you look at
that? It's probably a little over 7 years now, probably 8 or 9 now.
So any of you out there that, has been going above and beyond in any area like that, just consider that it's the type of thing that if you'll do it, it'll always show up. But if you set another intention that you've put your 7 years in, you've put your time, and you would just appreciate that energy going somewhere else to be supported, and then you're able to step into maybe something that someone else has been doing for 7 years. Because I look at this 7-year pattern as a deterioration on these 5 different levels. And again, there's the physical, the mental, the emotional, the energetic, and the spiritual levels that we're constantly talking about on this podcast and the philosophy. So it's, that's what overall well-being is all about, is seeing how just the way that we look at something affects all 5 levels of our field. And in order to correct something or bring wellness into one's whole being, we need to look at all 5 of those levels. And we do a pretty good job here of breaking it down on those different levels, but we're going to go even deeper in some upcoming episodes.
Okay, so I'm going to transition back to the heat story. So my electrician told me he'd be at my house Wednesday morning, and he is he's a character. He has a lot of energy. I enjoy being around him, but to him, Wednesday morning, it could be 8 in the morning, it could be 11:59.
Right.
I don't know what it's going to be. So I made sure I got up early just in case, because I didn't want to inconvenience him or miss him if he's knocking on my door and I'm sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
So I woke up early and I kind of started my day. It's hard for me to do my daily structure when I'm waiting on somebody or I'm expecting somebody to come in.
Right.
So that's I don't know what that is. It's hard to focus for me anyway. But he eventually came more around 11:30 or so. And we went into the basement and he took the unit apart and he noticed some wires had been burned and shorted. So, that could have possibly been an issue that could have started a fire. So I did want to bring in the gratitude thing that you mentioned earlier, because once I saw that, I was able to then take a step back and have gratitude for something major not happening while I wasn't home. Because that is always I'll say a fear of mine, is that if I'm not home, something happens. And sometimes my imagination can go wild and with thoughts like that, which I try to keep under wraps. But so when I did see that, I was able to have gratitude that, this wasn't as serious as it could have been.
Right. And that's, this is a time where money is tight for a lot of people, and any kind of inconvenience like that can be disheartening. But to really work during this time of the season of gratitude, to, like you were just saying, to really find that appreciation of, this could have burned my house down. So if I've got to shell out, a few $100s, yes, it's very inconvenient, but there's just so much to be grateful for. And that helps with this acceptance process, because when you're able to see what could have happened, you're not manifesting or creating that in your life. You're using that as a tool to get to that gratitude. And I think that that's something that many people can utilize in these times that we're in right now, especially.
So he rewired and replaced all those wires. And those electric wands that you hold up to a wire and it beeps if there's electric. So he went through and he checked it like that, and everything beeped. So he was like, okay, go check the thermostat, and the thermostat was still off. So he did a little more poking around and thought that maybe there was like a reset button on the circuit board that had to be pushed. But he told me that I had to call my HVAC company to have them come out. So I was in acceptance of that because I don't know anything about electricity, so I'm trusting that he's right. And so I did call them, and they came out and put a meter up to the breakers that my electrician had put in and replaced, and noticed that some of the voltage was off. And they said, well, we can't tell you if there's anything wrong with the unit until the voltage is correct, and we're not electricians, so you need to call your electrician back.
Right.
And so I did have to pay them to have a service call fee to have them come out to tell me that, which is the second time this has happened, because I've had my electrician help me on actually the last time that the same issue was happening, where there was a short in the breaker, but for some reason the wires weren't burnt back then. And the same thing happened. My electrician told me I had to have the HVAC people come out. They came out and said that, it's the breaker. And then, so the same pattern is arising, and I'm like, in a little disbelief, slight frustration, but more, I'm trying to keep a level of entertainment through this.
Right. It's a good tool.
And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I like to just laugh. And I know there can be a difference between like a laugh as in like, if I don't laugh, I'm going to cry. And a laugh as in, this is entertaining. And it's funny how like this is all playing out again. It's ironic that it's like the same process, the same pattern that has happened last year. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what your take on with utilizing humor in these certain situations.
No, I think it's a good tool because, sometimes if you don't laugh, you will get angry. So it's a subconscious way of releasing energy, basically.
Okay. Yeah. I would say that's pretty close to what I was doing. So I did call my electrician back, and I told him the situation, and he said he'd be over later. So he came over and he put a meter up, and he didn't notice there was something. And so in my head, I'm like, why didn't he use a meter before? He just kind of used the wand. And I was able to tap into something that I kind of do, which is I've seen him. He is somebody who doesn't just do house and residential electrical stuff. And he used to even be the head of one of the counties, the head guy who checks everything. I forget what they're called. Inspector. Yeah. So just by being that, I know he knows what he's doing. He's not incompetent. And he works on like setting up, huge buildings and gas stations and wiring all that. So I can see how this could be, he's my friend. He could just be doing this like subconsciously because I was able to tap into, web development. And when a client comes and says, we have this small bug on something, I'll go in and it's kind of like subconscious. I know what it is and I just fix it and I don't test it. And then I tell the project manager, it's done. And then a few minutes later, or, maybe even a day later, they come back and say, no, there's another issue or it's still not fixed. And I'm like, oh man, why didn't I take the extra time to just test it? Why? And then I start to get a little like frustrated with myself that I just didn't do that, because I like to maintain a certain level of like integrity. And I feel like that's. Yeah,
and I think this is a beautiful place to bring in. We've done an episode on playing roles. And so this is a great example of how I like to look at that perception even deeper. Yes, sometimes a professional and somebody that knows what they're doing and do it so repetitious that they shouldn't hardly ever make a mistake. And same for you with the web development. When we are involved in other people's energies, we are playing roles now in their world. And so for whatever reason, that needed to happen for you, for that electrician to come out, say, okay, it's good. Then the other people come out, say, no, it's not good, have to bring him back out. Like you said, that should be very routine for him to be able to check that and know that before leaving. And this gets into forgiveness and why it does no good to get angry, because we're a partnership in every type of connection that we make. And our, whether you want to call it karma or our lessons that we need to learn, are tied together once we make a connection, even if it's professionally. So see, that could have been something that he needed to learn a lesson from, or that you needed to. I don't really get into that too much myself, because I'm always just looking for what my lesson is. And so through all of that, really considering that he was just playing a role, because that should have been something that he checked and blah, blah, blah. And why this is able to give us an opportunity to give ourselves forgiveness when it does happen to us, and is something that we might go and beat ourselves up for days, because we just didn't check that. But if that other person or your client needed to go through more resistance to learn their lesson, then see, you're playing that role to not follow through like you always would. That's why when we hear phrases like, I don't know why I said that, or I don't know why I didn't do that, that is normally a very big key, and I call it big green lights going off of, you're playing a role. You're in a role here, and they needed to learn a lesson. So this is very, very deep topic that I'm sure we'll expand on at some point in time, but I did want to just touch on that a little bit more with the roles there. Were you following those connections as far as the role? And if so, what do you just hypothetically think that your role could have been to have that electrician come back out twice?
Well, I didn't, like, the term roles didn't come into my head. I wasn't thinking that essentially that there could be a role being played, but I thought about, where do I do this?
Okay.
Because, and I was and like you said, brought up forgiveness. It allowed me to not take it personally, because I could feel myself like starting like that, and that energy, those thoughts, those voices in my head starting to want to get upset and get frustrated, but I was able to stay present. And even when the HVAC guy was there, I was explaining to him what could have happened, in like almost sticking up for my electrician, being like, oh, hey, no, he does all this great work, and he probably just, quickly did it and subconsciously didn't check. And, this could have been avoided, but because that guy was apologizing for not being an electrician and not being able to help me further. So I was trying to make him feel better and understand that I understand that he can't help me. Right.
And so I think that's a great reflection that you used of, where do I do this? And I think that's great for people to do. And then that other one is, what kind of role might I have just been playing, or what type of role may he have been playing? And I just want to throw just a hypothetical out there for you to help our listeners, that quite possibly it could have been a boundary and standing in your power thing, to where you don't want to, and I'm saying this with question mark, like hurt anybody's feelings or make them or question them too much. And so this is where our intuition sometimes can come in, and we might get a hit to like, hey, double check, and ask them to double check that. And then you just go, no, I'm not going to be one of those kind of clients. And then that could be part of that mistake. So bringing that in, because we've been talking a lot lately about standing in your power, and we just released the, who you are, what you're about, and what you exemplify. And this could directly be connected to that it's not that we should check up on people all the time, but pay attention to our intuition. And if we get a hit, then, sometimes this is where I'm not the biggest fan of manners, because manners can get in the way of consciousness, because we can get that hit, and then we don't want to question the so-called professional or the friend, and then it takes more time and blah, 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 blah. So that was just another view, but I think you're also utilizing that to say, where do I do something similar is a great way to approach it too.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did have a hit on my intuition. I did, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I may not have brought that up because I didn't remember it just now, but when you said that, I did. Because in the past, last year, the breaker I guess there was a short, and when that happens, the breaker was popping off the breaker board or panel, and I would have to go in and like slam it back in, because that's actually what I did when I noticed it was off, and it came back on that Monday morning for like 10 minutes, and then pop, I heard it and I smelled burning.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to bother with it again. And then that's when I called my electrician. But when he was down there explaining to me what he was doing, because I like to be right there because I can learn something, by watching them. I don't know a lot about electricity or HVAC units.
Right.
So I just want to learn as much as possible and see what they're doing. But I also know that I'm with anything with my house, I'm tapped in to like an energetic level. Like I have senses that I can feel. And like you said, intuition, I guess that is, a good word to describe it. And so when he was telling me that it was probably these wires, I was like, but that breaker kept popping out. So I was asking him questions about it. I didn't want to be like, can you check that breaker?
Right.
I was like, so what about the breaker? Why was it popping off? And he gave me an explanation as to why. And I was like, okay, well, that's plausible. So the breaker could still be good, and it was just popping off because of the short. And now because there's no more short, it will probably not pop off anymore.
Right.
Because originally I thought it was just the breaker that was the issue, but once I saw the short, I was like, okay, that's probably what's causing it. And it wasn't what I thought it was. What it was. It could have been something down the line. It's not always what we see, what it seems, or what we can see.
Right. Right. And I think that, learning to trust that intuition and bringing, your human design in, that, your design is to respond. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the initial response, right? The gut response. Yeah. So see, when we're dealing with things, this is why being able to stay in acceptance and not in friction. And now that next step of learning to pay attention to that, just that intuition, and go, hey, I trust these people are professionals here, but if I get a hit, I'm not going to feel embarrassed to go and just say, hey, would you mind checking this again? That doesn't mean that you micromanage everything, because once again, you should be in non-preference and only act if you get a hit to act. But I think this has been a great kind of example of the difference between approaching something with resistance and approaching something with acceptance. And the results are very, very different. Very different.
Yeah, and in the past, when I have gotten hits on my intuition, I will ask as many questions as possible until I feel comfortable, and until they can explain why and make me feel comfortable in whether to prove my intuition wrong, or maybe it wasn't, or whatever it is. I will. I'm not somebody who will just sit back and let it just be there and not at least put it out there.
Right.
So when he came back and he put the meter up, he then pulled that breaker off, looked at it, and it was completely burnt. Mm-hmm. And so he was like, oh, there's your problem. And he's such an interesting character, because he has a way of like nothing sticks to him, or like, right. So he was like, oh, almost like I didn't say anything about it, or like he just discovered it, or
but didn't take any blame.
Yes,
for not
exactly.
Yes.
I was just like, yep, okay, I'm glad you found it. So he was like, well, you're gonna be without heat for another day, because I have to go buy one, because this isn't one that you can just find on a store. So I was like, right. Okay, I can do one more night. So he came back the next day and set it up, and it worked. But that whole experience, like we just talked about, brought up a lot. I did have to pay extra money because of that oversight. Mm-hmm. But in looking at the entire thing, I mean, I took it as it's my lesson, maybe for not saying something more in my power, and being like, no, can you just take a look at that and help me, because I feel something there. I don't know if I know there's a better way to say that.
Yeah, but even to say, because I don't want to bother you to have to come back out. So I'm sure it's fine, but if you could just appease me. There's, of course, always a kind way to do it. But once again, this isn't about micromanaging. It would be following, an intuitional hit. And if that's not there, then there's no need to engage. So once again, we're bringing in discernment. And discernment is optimally done in the neutral space, the space of non-preference. So that's why this acceptance and being in neutrality, and that's where you're able to trust your intuition when you're able to separate them from those emotions. And that is the definition of responding in the just philosophy, as opposed to reacting and going into resistance, and then what follows resistance. So there's two completely different paths: the acceptance path, which we call the polarity path in one of the 5 pillars, or the resistance path, which we call duality. And there is a difference between duality and polarity. Everything on this planet, from what my observations over 26 years, is based off of polarity. But duality only exists when we want something to be different than it is, when we can't accept the way that something is. And once again, get this across to people that because you accept it does not mean you agree with it. But you need to accept it before you can shift it, or your shifting is like a rubber band. It's just going to pull right back. So I think we've covered a lot of good stuff today and touched on some areas I think we're going to expand on in future podcasts.
I did want to bring one last thing in, which is the level of energy, or on the energetic level, that I had when I came home Sunday night and saw it. I wasn't low on energy,
Right.
I mean, I did just drive 6.5 hours, but I was in a state of like lightness, and I was not frustrated already. So when I did see that allowed me to have the space, because I know myself, and when I'm energetically drained, I can start feeling my shortness with things, with like normal things,
Sure.
things that wouldn't bother me normally. And if I allowed the heat issue to lower my energy, I can only imagine my reaction would have been when I woke up and saw the dog on Monday morning.
Right. And then it would have been, he come out, then he said, you got to wait till Wednesday. This is the avalanche, the way the avalanche just builds and builds and builds. And then the guy would have come out and told you that you got to bring your electrician back out. So see, it was the perfect setup for the perfect storm. And from my viewpoint and from your practicing, it's that acceptance and seeing that polarity. Hey, okay, something didn't work out here the way I carry a preference. Let me look at that. Why am I carrying this preference? Let me, once again, go back to the first pillar of everything's in divine order, or find the divine order in the chaos. And I think this is a great example or a great podcast about the first pillar, and that at each step you were able to find the divine order and work with the friction as it came. So once again, I think it's a great example for people out there, and just take these two subjects and find, you listeners, whatever's going on in your life and wherever you have resistance, and truly look at those two different paths of duality or polarity, whether you're in resistance to it and the avalanche that follows that, or whether you're working on acceptance and the smooth sailing that normally goes with that.
And in closing, I did want to just bring this back around to breaking patterns. Why is it important that we do break these patterns when they keep being brought to us? Or in this instance, did I move enough energy, or did I have a different reaction to this than I normally would, enough to break the pattern? Then, in your opinion of how energy works, how may it show up differently?
I like to think that, or suggest that life has a sense of humor. So many times when we break these patterns, like you said, part of this was done subconsciously, so you could see that your work in other areas has really helped this. But to say that you're never going to run into something similar, I wouldn't consider that. All I would say is it could be more than a year before you get revisited by that. It could be 3 or 5 years before something similar happens. And every time is just like a check-in. That's why, I like to suggest to people, do we really heal anything, or do we learn to manage it? And through managing it, just like people or children, things get easier, but that doesn't mean that problems don't occur. You just learn to manage them better and quicker to get back into that flow. So I think that that's the key of getting rid of this fix-it attitude, and to learn that it's really a part of, like, similar to raising a child. As I've said many times, gaining consciousness is very similar to raising a child, and that if you raise a child optimally, you break their patterns very quickly. If you're raising yourself and raising your consciousness, you break those patterns really quickly. But that doesn't mean that the child's not going to go 2 or 3 years and then do something very similar. But normally, like I said, those check-ins become further and further apart. And that's the beauty of doing the work. It doesn't mean that you're relieved of it for the rest of your life, but it does mean that more than likely it's not going to come in for you to need to be faced with that lesson again for a while. We'll see.
Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this experience with everybody out there.
Yeah, I think it was a wonderful example of many things we talk about a lot.
And that will conclude this episode. Stay tuned for our 3 minutes of stillness. We appreciate your interest in self-growth, conscious communication, and continuing to ask the wise whys.
And remember, gradual changes over long periods of time equals lasting results.
The Just Philosophy, as discussed in this podcast, has been developed by Alexander over the last 22 years in his private practice, professional environment, and private studies. The information discussed is intended for educational purposes only. It is not meant as a replacement for conventional medicine. Just remember, knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. Seek the wise. As we continue sharing this information, there are also multiple ways to share and support this work. Gain access to our exclusive content, behind-the-scenes footage, and other products that assist you on your self-awareness journey by joining our patron team in exchange for a monetary donation by visiting wise-whys.com/patron. That is wise-whys.com/patreon. Another way of support is by sharing this podcast with receptive individuals or even leaving a review on popular platforms such as iTunes or Facebook helps us introduce this work to others through the listener's words. We are also on most major social networks, so follow us along there or even join our Facebook group community. Continue your journey by visiting Alexander's website where you are able to book private consultations in person, by phone, or even Skype. Know thyself better with human design and destiny card reports and readings, as mentioned in this podcast. View a calendar of his live performances and class schedule, peruse his other products such as shirts, CDs, and the revolutionary VibroTune sound vibrational therapy tables that assist with subtle energy alignments. So grab that keyboard and go to thejustphilosophy.com for those goodies. That's thejustphilosophy.com. And if you love the touch of a soft shirt with a message that will warm your heart in resonation, then check out my company, Verities Apparel, where I am a one-man band doing it all from design to physically printing the garment and sealing it all with a conscious touch. Just go to veritiesapparel.com, VERITEESAPPAREL.com. Thank you all for being a part of this journey with us.